A single espresso, one sip too many, and a motive steeped in bitterness. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. I'm curious, what corner of the world are you watching from? I love reading every comment you share. Let's begin. I'll say this much for Nero Wolfe. The man might weigh 1/7 of a ton and treat work like it's a communicable disease, but his loyalty to routine could shame a Swiss watch. At precisely 11 a.m. every weekday, the brownstone at West 35th Street becomes a sanctuary for orchids, obscure Latin oaths, and peace so thick you could slice it with a bread knife. So when the doorbell rang at 11:04 on a Thursday morning, rang, not buzzed, it was as if someone had kicked a sacred cow square in the shins. I was at my desk in the office, flipping through the morning's reports with all the enthusiasm of a man studying his own indictment. Fritz, our resident chef and walking gastronomic miracle, poked his head in, looking about as anxious as he gets without bursting into flames. "There's a visitor," he said. I cocked an eyebrow. "Client?" Fritz shook his head, tight-lipped. "She insists Mr. Wolfe will want to see her. She says it's about coffee." That got my attention. Coffee around here isn't just a beverage. It's practically a constitutional right. Wolfe's standards for it make the Pope's standards for sainthood look loose. Fritz would sooner serve a cold steak tartare than a bad cup of espresso. Shrugged into my jacket. "I'll handle it." The woman standing in the front room had the kind of poise you don't learn from charm school. Slim, dark-haired, about 30, with a tailored green dress that managed to be both expensive and businesslike. Her left hand clutched a small battered leather case. Her right hand clutched the strap of her purse like it might try to escape. "Miss," I prompted. "Elena Costa." Her voice had an accent, not heavy, but enough to hint at espresso bars and crooked sun-bleached streets somewhere south of Rome. "I must speak to Mr. Wolfe. It concerns a matter only he can resolve." I didn't smirk, but it was a near thing. "He doesn't resolve many matters before noon. If you'll tell me it is about betrayal." She lowered her voice. "About something that should have been pure, but has been corrupted." Well, that was a line, and not the usual kind. Before I could decide whether to usher her out or let her linger, a voice from the hallway, a voice so sonorous it could have recited tax codes and made them sound operatic, cut in, "Archie, bring her." I turned. To see Wolfe himself, framed in the office doorway like a broad, irate statue. He wore his mustard-yellow robe, a signal that he had been up in the plant rooms with his orchids, and was, therefore, in a perilous mood. When Wolfe voluntarily deviated from his schedule, even by a whisker, it meant one of two things. Either the world was ending or he smelled a problem intriguing enough to justify the apocalypse. I waved Miss Costa ahead of me and followed them both into the office. Wolfe settled into his massive chair behind his desk like a king returning to a slightly grubby throne. I remained standing, sensing that this was not going to be a routine morning. "Well, madam," Wolfe said, steepling his fingers under his chin. His eyes, brown, heavy-lidded, and as lively as two slabs of granite, pinned her to the Persian. Rug Elena Costa took a breath. Then, with the gravity of a woman confessing to a priest, she said, "I believe someone is trying to destroy my family's business. They are poisoning the Costa Espresso brand from within. I must find the traitor, and I am told you are the only man who can do it." The office went very quiet. Wolfe sighed, a long theatrical gust that signaled he was already regretting being alive today. But he didn't refuse, which meant we were in it, whether I liked it or not. Wolfe sat there staring at Elena Costa the way a python might consider a rabbit, not hungry necessarily, but interested enough to pause. I stayed standing. I'd learned the hard way that sitting too soon around Wolfe during a client meeting could earn you a dirty look or a fat paragraph of sarcasm, depending on how foul his mood was. Destroy the Costa brand, you say, Wolfe rumbled. Espresso. He said it like the word offended his sinuses. Elena nodded. Costa Espresso has been in my family for 3 generations. We have cafes in the Village, Midtown, and Park Slope. Last year, we launched our signature roasts online. Wolfe's eyelids drifted lower, the first warning sign of catatonia. Business details meant about as much to him as competitive ice dancing. Sensing this, Eleanor pushed the battered case onto Wolfe's desk and flipped it open. Inside were 2 slim silver packets and a folder. She slid the packets across the gleaming wood with delicate precision, like they might explode if handled wrong. One of these is genuine Costa Espresso, she said. The other is something else, inferior. Someone has infiltrated our supply chain. Orders are being filled with counterfeit beans. I had to hand it to her. She knew how to hit the right note. Wolfe's nostrils twitched. Counterfeit coffee might not sound like much to a jury, but to Nero Wolfe it was a crime that rated somewhere between arson and first-degree murder. You have evidence? Wolfe asked, still not touching the packets. Elena's fingers lingered on the folder. Receipts, shipping manifests, quality control tests, but no clear suspect. No murders, no violence. She shook her head. Not yet. I almost smiled. Wolfe preferred his crimes with minimal bloodstains. It kept the rugs cleaner. Wolfe grunted. Who are the principals? My brother Marco manages distribution. My cousin Sophia oversees the cafes. And my fiancé, her voice caught barely. Luca Moretti, he handles marketing. Wolfe's eyebrows climbed half an inch. Family. Dangerous. I thought he might brush her off there. Family feuds were messy, and Wolfe liked his clients as tidy as his socks. But instead he made a small, almost imperceptible motion with 2 fingers, his way of saying, go on. I believe one of them is involved, Elena said quietly. And if I confront them without proof, it will destroy everything. Wolfe closed his eyes. For a moment the only sound in the office was the slow, deliberate turning of his brain's gears. Then he opened them again. Archie, he said, fetch a demitasse and prepare an espresso. 1 sample of each. That made me blink. Wolfe asking me to prepare espresso was like asking a cat to juggle bowling pins. Fritz handled coffee. I handled suspects. Still, orders were orders. I headed for the kitchen, tossing a glance over my shoulder at Elena Costa. She was standing very still, watching Wolfe with an intensity that suggested she hadn't come here just for business. Wolfe, for his part, simply closed the battered leather case and rested his hands atop it, as if sealing a pact. The brownstone had been disturbed. And, if I knew Wolfe, it was only the beginning. It didn't take long for Wolfe to announce that we needed interviews. It also didn't take long for me to realize I was going to be the one doing the hoof work, while he held court with his orchids and maintained the natural order of the universe. Namely, him sitting down and me moving around. The espresso samples had been tasted. Wolfe's expression after the first sip of the counterfeit brew could have peeled paint off the office walls. No one else might have detected the difference, not the average commuter gulping coffee from a paper cup, but Wolfe did, and that was enough. Now, with Elena Costa gone for the afternoon and promising to return with more documents, Wolfe dispatched me to meet the inner circle of suspects. My orders were simple. Get close, get personal, and most importantly, get something they didn't intend to give. Fritz packed me off with a sandwich and a glare that warned against getting kidnapped or worse. Coming back after dinner time. First stop, Marco Costa. Marco Costa. Distribution with a side of disdain. Marco ran the distribution center in Brooklyn, a low-slung warehouse tucked into the edge of an industrial zone that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight since Prohibition. He was waiting for me by the loading, Docks, arms crossed, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. Tall, rangy, with a jaw you could crack walnuts on, Marco had the kind of attitude that could turn a friendly greeting into a minor skirmish. "You're Archie Goodwin? Elena's muscle?" I smiled at him, the kind of smile that usually makes people want to check their wallets. "No muscle," I said. "Just curious." Marco exhaled smoke sideways. "She sends you out here to snoop around?" Snoop is such an ugly word. I prefer investigate. He made a disgusted sound in his throat and turned on his heel, leading me into the warehouse. The place smelled like roasted beans, motor oil, and broken dreams. Pallets stacked with burlap sacks lined the walls. Men in stained uniforms shuffled past, giving me the once-over like they were pricing me for resale. Marco showed me the sorting area, a gleaming conveyor belt, a gleaming sample roaster, gleaming scales. Everything gleamed except Marco. "We run a clean operation," he said. "You want to find problems, you go look at the cafes, Sophia's kingdom." I made a note of the quick deflection, but let it ride. I was here to observe, not confront. "Mind if I poke around?" I asked. He shrugged. "Suit yourself, just don't touch anything." I spent half an hour wandering, chatting up the workers, sniffing the merchandise, figuratively and literally. Everyone towed the company line. Distribution was tight, inventory was tracked, and if bad beans were sneaking in, it wasn't happening here. Still, Marco's twitchy demeanor told me he had something to hide. Whether it was relevant or just personal shame over his hideous taste in aftershave, I couldn't say. Yet. Next stop, Sophia Costa. Sophia Costa, Espresso and Ego Sophia, ran the Costa cafes like a general running a temperamental army. I found her at the flagship shop in Greenwich Village, a sleek little joint with brushed metal chairs and a menu so minimalist it could have been written in Morse code. Sophia herself was perched behind the counter, wearing a fitted black dress, short, crimson nails, and a look that suggested she weighed every customer on an invisible scale before deciding whether they were worthy of caffeine. I ordered an espresso and flashed my most disarming smile. "Nice place," I said. She looked me up and down like she was checking me for fleas. "You're not a reviewer, are you?" "Nope. Name's Archie Goodwin. I'm working with your sister." Her eyes narrowed. "She's not my sister. She's my cousin." First misstep. Elena had called them family without footnotes. Sophia. It seemed liked precision. "What can I do for you, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, voice frosty. "Just gathering information. You know, standard due diligence." She set a tiny porcelain cup in front of me, with a gesture that suggested it would be the last kindness of the day. "There's nothing wrong with the cafes," she said. "If customers are complaining about the coffee, maybe it's because they wouldn't know good beans from rabbit droppings." I sipped. It was excellent, bitter, rich, clean. Whatever poison was slipping into Costa Espresso, it wasn't happening here. "You're sure none of your staff have access to the distribution lines?" I asked. She gave me a look normally reserved for people who propose outlawing air. "Of course not. We brew what we're given. Talk to Marco if you want to find rot." That was twice Marco had been thrown under the bus, and the tires were starting to look crowded. I left the cafe with more questions than answers, and a distinct sense that Sophia Costa would cheerfully push her cousin off a cliff if it meant better Yelp reviews. Luca Moretti, a smile with sharp edges. Last on my hit list was Luca Moretti, Elena's fiancé and Costa Espresso's marketing savant. He met me in a corner booth at some boutique hotel in Soho, wearing a designer suit and a smile so polished you could check your teeth in it. "Archie Goodwin," he said warmly, offering a hand that was suspiciously soft for a man in the coffee business. "Elena told me you might call." Unlike the Costas, Luca didn't bristle or posture. He played the friendly card. Too friendly, if you asked me. "I hear you've been managing the online brand," I said. "Indeed. Sales have tripled in a year. He flashed teeth. Which makes this sabotage even more tragic. You believe it's sabotage? His smile dimmed by half a watt. Something is wrong. Customer complaints about flavor, consistency. If Costa Espresso's reputation falters online, the whole business suffers. And you have no idea who might be behind it? He spread his hands innocently. I'm just the face. Distribution is Marco's domain. Cafes are Sophia's. I merely sell what they provide. Everyone pointing fingers at someone else. It was starting to feel like a merry-go-round where all the horses had switchblades. Luca leaned in. You must understand, Mr. Goodwin. Elena's family is complicated. Old resentments, inherited loyalties. It's a wonder things have held together this long. And you? I asked, sipping my drink. He shrugged lightly. I love Elena, and I want Costa Espresso to thrive. But love and business... He gave a little sigh. They don't always brew well together. He said it lightly, but there was something in his eyes, something cool and calculating, that didn't match the easy smile. By the time I wrapped up with Luca, I had a notebook full of polite lies, polished smiles, and simmering resentments. The inner circle was tight, family tight, and every one of them had both motive and opportunity. The only thing missing was proof. And if Nero Wolfe had taught me anything, it was that proof doesn't walk up and tap you on the shoulder. You have to stalk it, trap it, and drag it out into the light. I checked my watch, flagged a cab, and pointed it uptown. Time to report to the mountain. When I got back to the brownstone, the place smelled like victory and garlic, thanks to Fritz prepping dinner. I delivered my report to Wolfe in the office, while he slumped in his chair like a walrus waiting for the tide. He didn't interrupt much, just grunted here and there, a sound that meant keep talking, fool. When I finished, he said, Pui, a family enterprise is as prone to treachery as a snake pit. High praise in Wolfe's world. What next, boss? I asked. Observation, he said simply. We require behavior, not claims. Which was Wolfe's fancy way of saying, follow them. Watch. Wait. See who sweats when no one's watching. Lucky me. A shadow in Brooklyn. The next morning, I parked my maroon sedan 2 blocks from the distribution center and settled in for a long day of loitering. Legally, Marco Costa ran a tight ship. On the surface, he barked orders, scribbled notes, paced. Around noon, he disappeared for lunch, and that's when it got interesting. A skinny guy in a stained t-shirt slipped out the side door carrying a duffel bag. Now, normally, I don't get excited over guys with gym bags. New York's full of them. But this one was acting like the bag contained a nuclear football, clutching it close, darting glances over his shoulder. I tailed him 3 blocks to a grubby little garage, where he handed the bag off to a man in a leather jacket I didn't recognize. No paperwork, no clipboard. Just a quick exchange and a handshake like they were swapping contraband. I made a mental note, then followed leather jacket back to his car, a nondescript grey sedan. License plate memorized. Check. By the time I circled back to the warehouse, Marco was back at his desk, yelling into the phone about invoices. Nothing to see here, folks, except a side hustle happening under Marco's nose, or maybe right under. His wing, stirred not shaken in the village Sofia Costa's cafe, was next. I played it casual, grabbing a seat in the back with a newspaper while I kept an eye on the baristas. Around 2 p.m., Sophia emerged from the back office, face tight. She barked at a young employee, a nervous kid with a nose ring, about restocking the shelves properly. Then she stepped outside to take a phone call, pacing and waving her hands like she was conducting a very passionate orchestra. Normally, I don't eavesdrop unless invited. But Wolfe had made it clear. Observe everything. I slid out behind her, leaning casually against a lamppost. Sophia's voice carried just enough. I told you I can't cover the costs if the shipments aren't regular. You promised if Marco finds out it's over. That caught my ear like a fishhook. She hung up, cursed under her breath, and went back inside, leaving me with more questions than answers. Sophia clearly had a side arrangement cooking, one she didn't want Marco to know about. Family loyalty, my foot. The Costas were cannibalizing each other like starving rats. Luca's little diversions. Luca Moretti was trickier. His domain wasn't a fixed location, it was the city itself. Meetings, schmoozing, posing for press releases with steaming mugs of Costa Espresso in hand. I followed him for a full afternoon, dodging taxis and getting jostled by tourists. He made 3 stops: a graphic design firm in Chelsea, a photo shoot in Soho, and, more interestingly, a storefront on 10th Avenue with no signage, just a battered black door and a buzzer. He buzzed, slipped inside, and didn't come out for 45 minutes when he finally emerged. His face was tight, and he was carrying a slim, hard-edged briefcase, the kind you don't use for love letters. I snagged the address and made a note to look it up later. One thing was clear: Luca Moretti had business dealings he hadn't mentioned, and judging by the tension in his jaw, they weren't exactly above board. Brewing tension, that evening back at the brownstone, Wolfe and I went over everything. He listened, eyes half closed, while I recited my observations. When I finished, he opened them and gave me a look that suggested my brain was at least marginally functional. "Conclusions?" he asked. "Every one of them's dirty," I said. "Marco's got unauthorized shipments moving. Sophia's on the hook for unsanctioned costs. Luca's sneaking around back alley offices with mysterious briefcases." Wolfe grunted. "Motive, method, opportunity." "But no proof," I said. He nodded once. "Not yet." Silence hung for a moment, filled only by the distant sounds of Fritz clattering pots in the kitchen. Then Wolfe said, "Arrange interviews, not formal ones, casual engagements, press without pressing." "In other words," I said, "make them sweat without wringing them out." Wolfe allowed a microscopic smile. "Precisely. So that's how I found myself over the next 2 days, setting up a series of accidental meetings, bumping into Marco at his favorite deli, Sophia at her gym, Luca outside a gallery opening. Each encounter was calculated. Each one poked just a little, and each time I saw it. The flinch behind the smile, the twitch in the eyes, the delay in their answers. They were all hiding something, and none of them trusted each other any more than they trusted me. Trouble brews. Closer to home, it wasn't until Thursday morning that things got messy. I was in the office updating Wolfe when Fritz burst in, which alone was enough to make my pulse jump. "Mr. Wolfe," he gasped. "The kitchen. Someone's been tampering." Wolfe sat bolt upright, a feat equivalent to a minor earthquake. We rushed to the kitchen, where Fritz pointed to the spice rack, specifically a row of canisters Wolfe kept locked for rare herbs and infusions. The small brass lock was snapped, open, dangling uselessly. Inside, a glass vial labeled Berberis vulgaris, Wolfe's prized barberry extract, was missing. Wolfe stood there, staring, his face carved from stone. Someone had broken into his inner sanctum, not for money, not for sabotage, for a message, a warning. The case wasn't just brewing trouble anymore. It had boiled over. If Nero Wolfe has a religion, it isn't the orchids or even the food. It's the sanctity of the brownstone. You could swindle him, lie to him, even call him names in the papers, and he'd brush it off with a grunt and a quote from Plutarch. But to trespass in his home, to violate the order of his inner kingdom, that was sacrilege, and someone had just committed it. He stood over the spice rack, like a Roman senator surveying a ruined temple. His hands were jammed deep into the pockets of his canary-yellow robe. His face was set and dark, the way a face gets just before it explodes or implodes. Fritz hovered near the stove, wringing his hands, a thing I'd never seen him do before. and never want to see again. I stayed quiet, waiting for the volcano. When Wolfe finally spoke, his voice was low and precise, every syllable honed like a scalpel. "Archie." "Yes, sir." "You will immediately check every point of ingress, front door, rear, cellar, windows. Look for any sign of tampering." I didn't argue. I nodded and hustled out. A house out of tune. I worked my way through the brownstone like a beat cop. On a parade route, windows latched, rear door solid, cellar bolt untouched. Nothing obvious, no broken glass, no jimmy marks. But when I circled back to the front hall, I noticed something odd. The umbrella stand, a battered old ceramic monster. Wolfe hated but refused to replace, was shifted 2 inches to the left. 2 inches isn't much. You wouldn't spot it unless you knew the place by heart, which I did. It told me 2 things. 1, whoever broke in hadn't been in a hurry. 2, they didn't know, or didn't care, that Wolfe would catch even the smallest disturbance like a hawk catching a mouse. I returned to the kitchen to find Wolfe still standing over the empty spice slot, like it owed him an explanation. "No forced entry," I reported. "Front stands nudged, otherwise clean." He nodded once, grimly. "An invited guest," he said. "Or someone with the means to bypass locks without evidence." Fritz finally found his voice. "But Mr. Wolfe, how could anyone?" Wolfe cut him off with a raised hand. "It is a demonstration," he said. "A message." I didn't need a dictionary to catch his meaning. Whoever was behind the Costa sabotage had decided to move the battle from warehouses and cafes to our doorstep. The question was, why? To intimidate Wolfe into dropping the case, or to provoke him into rushing his hand? Wolfe naturally wasn't intimidated by anything short of a famine, and he never rushed unless an earthquake moved the chair out from under him. He turned to me. "We must bait the hook." I arched an eyebrow. "With what?" He smiled faintly, not a pleasant smile, with the appearance of progress. "Fishing." With bare hooks the plan, as always, was deceptively simple. I was to call each of the 3 suspects, Marco, Sophia, and Luca, separately, and suggest, in that way you suggest without actually saying, that Wolfe was on the verge of a breakthrough. Nothing. Concrete, nothing libelous, just a little bird seed scattered on the trail. If one of them had nerves frayed enough to snap, Wolfe was betting they'd make a mistake. So I spent the next hour on the phone, performing verbal ballet. To Marco, I said Wolfe had developed a theory involving supply line discrepancies. To Sophia, I mentioned that Wolfe had uncovered intriguing financial inconsistencies linked to cafe inventory. To Luca, I hinted darkly about unusual marketing practices and unauthorized partnerships. Each call was met with silence, the loaded, deadly kind, and clipped goodbyes. I hung up and rejoined Wolfe in the office, where he sat, hands folded across his gut, like a spider waiting for tremors on the web. "All done," I said. "Now." "We wait, now we watch," Wolfe corrected. The watchers watched. The brownstone became a fortress that night. I stayed downstairs, keeping an ear tuned for any unusual creaks, buzzes, or knocks. Fritz prowled the kitchen like a restless ghost. Wolfe remained in his office, reading Montaigne with the book held at an angle only he could endure. Nothing happened, at least not visibly, but the tension coiled in the air so thick you could have carved it and served it with bechamel. Around 2 a.m. I thought I heard a soft scraping at the rear alley door. I slipped out with a flashlight and checked. Nothing. The door was locked, the alley empty except for the usual city smells and a cat glaring at me from atop a trash can. False alarm, maybe. Or maybe not. The next morning, Fritz discovered something else. Something worse. A small envelope, tucked neatly into the morning milk delivery. It was cream-colored, unmarked. No stamp, no address. Inside, a single slip of paper, The words typed in neat block letters. Stop stirring the pot or the brew gets bitter. No signature. Wolfe read it, grunted, and placed it carefully in his desk drawer. If our adversary hoped to unnerve us, he said, they should have invested more effort. Still, I didn't like it. Threats are easy to make. Follow-through, unfortunately, isn't much harder. Wolfe summoned Saul Panzer, our best operative, to supplement my footwork. When Saul arrived, short, dapper, and looking as relaxed as a man stepping into a chess game, Wolfe briefed him without raising his voice above conversational volume. "Mr. Panzer," he said, "you will discreetly monitor the movements of Mr. Marco Costa, Miss Sophia Costa, and Mr. Luca Moretti. Archie will assist as needed. We are seeking nervousness, rashness, anxious deviations." "Got it," Saul said. "And Archie," Wolfe added, turning his eyes to me, "you will make yourself available for unofficial inquiries." I didn't like the sound of that, but I nodded. Unofficial inquiries meant poking in dark corners, without a badge or backup. My specialty. Before Saul and I could even set the plan fully into motion, the next move came to us. Late that afternoon, Elena Costa returned to the brownstone, unannounced, frantic, and visibly upset. She burst into the office, scattering the afternoon calm like a shotgun blast. "Mr. Wolfe, Archie, something terrible has happened." I moved fast, catching her by the elbow before she knocked over the globe bar. "Easy," I said. "Breathe." She clutched her purse with white knuckles. Marco's been attacked." That pulled Wolfe upright a whole inch in his chair. "Explain," he said curtly. "This morning," she gasped. "He was found unconscious at the Brooklyn warehouse. Someone struck him from behind. They say it might have been a robbery, but nothing was taken, nothing except—" She stopped, swallowing hard. Wolfe's voice was a low growl. "Except what?" She looked up, her dark eyes full of certainty. "A shipment of Costa Espresso beans, a special batch, our flagship line." Silence fell. The game had changed. Now it wasn't just counterfeiting, now it was violence. And Nero Wolfe, who loathed physical disorder almost as much as he loathed walking, leaned forward slightly in his chair, a sure sign that someone, somewhere, had just made a very dangerous mistake. Violence has a way of rearranging a case, and people, like a fist through a chessboard. One minute we were dealing with coffee beans and sneaky sabotage. The next, Marco Costa was cooling his heels in a hospital bed with a head the size of a cantaloupe, and no idea what hit him. It wasn't fatal, but it was loud, and it sent the rest of the Costa inner circle scuttling like cockroaches when the lights come on. Wolfe naturally refused to budge from his chair, but he dispatched me and Saul Panzer like bloodhounds, one sleek, one street-smart, to turn over every rock that trembled. The heat was on, stirring up dust in Brooklyn first order of business. I paid a visit to the scene of the assault, the Costa Distribution Center in Brooklyn, the same warehouse where I'd tailed the duffel bag deal a few days earlier. The cops had come and gone, chalk outlines faded into the concrete dust. The foreman, a thick-necked guy named Tito, was more nervous than a turkey in November. "No." "Witnesses?" I asked, pacing the main floor. Tito wiped his forehead. "Nah, man, lunch rush. Everybody was out. Marco stayed back to catch up on shipments. Next thing, wham, we find him by the back stairs." "What about cameras?" He grimaced. "System's been busted for weeks. Marco said it wasn't priority. Convenient." I poked around the warehouse looking for anything out of place. The bay doors were locked tight, the crates undisturbed, except one corner where a new shipment should have been. According to Tito, a specialty batch had just arrived from Costa's roasting plant. Their flagship reserve, a rare bean blend they charged customers the price of a small mortgage to sip. Now it was gone, along with whoever decided that smashing Marco's skull was easier than signing an invoice. Saul's thin thread. While I was kicking dust around Brooklyn, Saul Panzer was putting his own moves into play. He called mid-afternoon, his voice as calm as a pond on a windless day. "I have." "Something," he said. That was Saul speak for "pay attention, this matters." I found him 2 blocks from Luca Moretti's swank apartment building, leaning against a lamppost and blending in with the scenery. "Luca's been busy," Saul said, flicking his eyes toward the building. "How busy?" Saul lit a cigarette, with the kind of casualness that only comes from absolute certainty. "He met a man named Vincent De Luca 3 nights this week. Quiet meetings, short chats." "De Luca?" I repeated. The name rang a faint, ugly bell. Saul nodded. "Connected to a private distribution network. Off books, not coffee, usually." I didn't need a primer to know what that meant. Black market dealings, smuggling. Whatever moved fastest and paid best, from pirated electronics to contraband food supplies. In other words, Luca Moretti had friends in low places. Very low. And given the missing Costa shipment, he had motives. That didn't require much imagination. De Luca's crew could have swiped that batch, Saul said. I nodded grimly, and put Marco in the hospital if he got in the way. Saul crushed the cigarette under his heel. Or if Luca thought Marco suspected. That made 2 things clear. 1, the family wasn't just feuding, it was fracturing. 2, Wolfe's quiet war was about to go public if we didn't move fast. Sophia's shell game, I wasn't done. While Saul kept Luca under a lazy sort of surveillance, I dropped in, unannounced, on Sophia Costa. She was at her cafe, looking polished but brittle, sipping an espresso that probably cost more than my shirt. When she saw me, her mouth twisted like she'd bitten into something sour. "I heard about Marco," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Yes." Her voice was clipped. "Terrible." "You seem devastated." She set her cup down hard enough to make it rattle. "Marco made enemies, suppliers, employees, customers." "You think it was random?" I asked. Her nostrils flared. "I think, when you run a business as carelessly as Marco did, you invite chaos." There it was. The real Sophia Costa, sharp, selfish, and about as sympathetic as a parking meter. "And the missing shipment?" I asked, watching her eyes. She shrugged, casual on the surface but taut underneath. "We lose shipments all the time. Theft, damage." "It's unfortunate." I leaned in, voice dropping. "You're in debt, aren't you?" That got her. A flicker across her face, a quick, almost imperceptible panic, before she smoothed it out. "I'm managing my affairs," which was as good as a confession that she was knee-deep in the red and getting deeper. No wonder she was desperate. No wonder she'd been whispering into phones about hidden costs and keeping Marco out of the loop. But desperate enough to steal a shipment and stage an assault. Maybe, maybe not. Wolfe's web tightens when I got back to the brownstone that evening. Wolfe was waiting. He hadn't moved, of course, but his eyes had the gleam of a man watching a house of cards collapse just as he predicted. "Report," he said. I laid it out. Marco's shady warehouse, stripped clean. Saul's sighting of Luca with black market buddies. Sophia's financial desperation, more brittle than she wanted to admit. When I finished, Wolfe closed his eyes, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the arm of his chair. "They are each culpable," he murmured, "each compromised." "But who hit Marco?" I asked. Wolfe's fingers stopped tapping. "Not the one who feared exposure," he said. "The one who feared exclusion." He opened his eyes, heavy and deliberate. "Archie summoned them here tomorrow." "All 3?" I asked, a little surprised. Wolfe didn't usually like turning the office into a circus unless he was ready to drop the final curtain. "All 3, he said. "It is time to strain the broth." I called the Costas and Luca one after another, setting appointments for noon sharp. No excuses, no delays. Wolfe's tone brooked no argument. They would come. The web was set, and if I knew Wolfe, And I do. Tomorrow, someone was going to walk straight into it and tangle themselves beyond escape. No one in their right mind enjoys being summoned by Nero Wolfe. It's not the invitation itself. Those are always courteous enough. It's the knowledge that once you step into that office, you're playing his game on his turf under his rules. And the rules, in case you haven't heard, are simple. Wolfe always wins. At precisely noon the next day, the front bell rang. I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and opened the door to 3 versions of barely concealed hostility. Marco Costa looked pale and hollowed out from his head injury, but stubborn enough to limp into battle. Sophia Costa, in a trim blue jacket and sunglasses, a sure sign she didn't want anyone reading her eyes, stalked past me without a word. Luca Moretti, impeccable as ever in a charcoal suit and a thin smile, brought up the rear like a man, arriving at a duel he didn't expect to lose. They gathered in the front room like cats tossed into a sack, stiff, wary, and just about ready to start clawing. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting you," I said, with the kind of cheer usually reserved for firing squads. I led them into the office. Wolfe was already there, of course, sitting behind his desk like a mountain waiting for the weather to change. He didn't rise. He never does. But he did incline his head the barest fraction, which for Wolfe is practically a bear hug. They settled into the 3 client chairs, awkward and tense. I took my spot by the wall, notebook ready, eyes sharper. Then my pencil. Wolfe waited until the silence thickened to the breaking point before speaking. "You are aware," he said, "that a serious crime has been committed." No preamble, no softening. Marco shifted, wincing slightly. Sophia crossed her arms. Luca adjusted his cufflinks with exaggerated nonchalance. "We have learned," Wolfe continued, voice smooth and heavy as cream, "of theft, of sabotage, of violence." He paused, letting the words land like pebbles into a pond. "No formal accusations will be made today." Another pause. "Today we will simply discuss possibilities." Sophia bristled. "I didn't come here to be accused." Wolfe's eyes slid to her half-lidded. "You came here because you fear what I know." That shut her up. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "You are each aware of the circumstances, the counterfeit beans, the tampered shipments, the assault on Marco Costa. These are not isolated events. They are deliberate acts of sabotage against Costa Espresso." Marco gave a weak cough. "Maybe it was competitors, other roasters." Wolfe shook his head almost sadly. "No, Mr. Costa. External competitors act differently. They undermine reputation publicly. What we face is internal erosion, a parasite that eats from within." He leaned back slightly, surveying them like a man assessing a hand of cards he already knows he's going to win. "Each of you," he said softly, "possesses motive." He turned to Marco. "You manage distribution. Profitable side deals would not be impossible, especially if debts accumulated elsewhere." Marco flushed but said nothing. Wolfe shifted his gaze to Sophia. "You oversee the cafes. Financial irregularities suggest pressures you have not publicly disclosed. Desperation makes many things permissible." Sophia's mouth tightened into a hard line. Finally, Wolfe's eyes settled on Luca. "You control the brand's image and external relations. Your associations are colorful, and your access to off-market distribution channels would facilitate swift, profitable theft." Luca smiled thinly. "Speculation, Mr. Wolfe." "Indeed," Wolfe agreed almost pleasantly. "But speculation can be verified. That is why you are here." He gestured lazily toward the folder on his desk, thick, weighty, ominous. "In here," he said, "are affidavits. Surveillance logs, financial audits." I knew better than anyone that most of that folder was blank. Wolfe didn't believe in presenting all his cards too soon, But it wasn't about the contents, it was about the idea of the contents. The trap was baited. Now all we had to do was watch who flinched first, tightening the noose. The minutes ticked by like slow drips from a leaky faucet. Wolfe let the silence stretch, each second a tightening band around the suspects' throats. Marco shifted, scratched his temple. Sophia kept darting glances at the folder, as if trying to X-ray it with sheer willpower. Luca stayed still, but I caught a tiny tick in his jaw, the smallest crack in his polished veneer. When Wolfe finally spoke again, his voice was soft but implacable. "You are each free to leave. No formal charges will be laid at this time." 3. Pairs of eyes blinked at him, stunned. "However," Wolfe continued, "I will be making my conclusions known to Miss Elena Costa." That landed like a depth charge. If Eleanor chose to act, to cut ties, to bring lawyers into it, fortunes could be wrecked overnight, deals would crumble, reputations would tank faster than a cement boot in the East River. Wolfe stood. Another. Rare move, a seismic event in itself, that is all. He turned away from them, signaling the meeting's end as definitively as slamming a door. Aftershocks, they filed out like zombies. Marco left first, moving stiffly, as if every step hurt. Sophia followed, sunglasses on, mouth set in a grim slash. Luca lingered half a beat longer, his eyes meeting Wolfe's with a glint of something, admiration maybe, or hatred. It's a fine line. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, Wolfe sagged back into his chair like a mountain resettling. I whistled low. "Nice work, boss." He didn't smile, but a faint glow of satisfaction lit his face. "They will not sleep easy tonight," he said. "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Wolfe said. "We force a hand." He opened the drawer of his desk, pulled out the threatening note we'd received tucked into the milk delivery, and placed it neatly on top of the so-called dossier. "The saboteur has two choices, retreat or attack." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming. "I do not believe they are capable of retreat." Brewing a storm, the rest of the day passed in a tight, waiting silence. I kept a casual eye on the street from the front room, making occasional circuits of the brownstone. Fritz cooked dinner, but none of us had much appetite. The air felt charged, the way it does before a summer thunderstorm. Around 9 p.m. the phone rang. Wolfe answered himself. Another shock. His side of the conversation was short, clipped. When he hung up, he turned to me. "That was Miss Costa," he said. "Elena?" He nodded. "She received an offer, an anonymous proposal to buy her controlling shares in Costa Espresso, immediately at a premium, provided she resigns without inquiry." I let out a low whistle. Somebody's scared. Wolfe's smile was small and terrible, indeed, and desperate. He closed his eyes, savoring it. "Tomorrow, Archie. Tomorrow we shall gather them once more and end it." If Nero Wolfe believes in ceremony, it's the kind where the headsman sharpens his axe in full view of the crowd. At 11:59 a.m. the next day, the brownstone smelled of leather, cigars, and inevitability. Fritz had polished the brass fittings to a high shine. I had moved the extra chairs into position, one for each of our guests, facing Wolfe's massive desk like pews before a pulpit. At noon sharp, the doorbell rang. This time, I didn't bother with small talk. I ushered them straight in, one after another. Marco Costa, pale, defensive, nervous energy coming off him in waves. Sophia Costa, steely and brittle, clutching her purse like it contained a parachute. Luca Moretti, smiling thinly, but the cracks were showing at the edges, a man out of easy lies and desperate for footing. And finally Elena Costa herself, solemn, composed, carrying herself like a woman who knew the house was on fire and had decided she would not be the one to burn. Wolfe sat behind his desk, mountainous and implacable, waiting until everyone was seated before lifting his eyes. He didn't waste time. "You are here because you have exhausted your lies," he said, his voice as dry as sun-baked earth. There was a small collective stiffening. Luca's hand twitched toward his tie. Marco shifted in his seat. Sophia's jaw hardened visibly. Wolfe ignored the reactions. He continued, as though delivering a eulogy. "I have been asked to determine how Costa Espresso's quality was undermined, why its reputation suffered, and who engineered the theft of its prized shipment." He paused. "And by extension, who assaulted Mr. Marco Costa." That landed like a dropped anvil. Marco blinked furiously, glancing sideways at Luca and Sophia. Wolfe folded his hands, one atop the other, and leaned back in his chair. "In such matters," he said, "the motive is profit or protection, often both." He turned his gaze on Marco. "Mr. Costa, your management of distribution has not been as rigorous as advertised." Marco flinched. I don't know what you—" Wolfe cut him off with a single raised finger. "Your underlings conducted unauthorized shipments, siphoning legitimate beans to private buyers. You were either complicit or negligent. In either case, the consequence was the same: supply chain vulnerability." Marco's mouth opened, then closed. I admired his restraint. Most men would have blurted or bolted by now. Wolfe turned to Sophia next. "Miss Costa, your financial entanglements are known. Loans against the cafe properties, unpaid suppliers, extravagant expansions unsupported by cash flow. Your desperation made you susceptible to alternate sources of supply." Sophia said nothing, but the tips of her ears turned red. "And you, Mr. Moretti," Wolfe said, settling his gaze on Luca with a heavy finality. "You possess the skill to conceal transactions, manipulate public narratives, and arrange quiet partnerships outside official channels." Luca smiled coolly. "Skill is not guilt." "No," Wolfe said, voice dropping, "but opportunity, motive, and demonstrated action are." He picked up a folder from the desk, a different folder from yesterday, and flipped it open. Inside was the printout Saul had delivered just that morning. Surveillance photos of Luca Moretti meeting Vincent De Luca. Time-stamped. Clear. Wolfe held up one of the photos like a priest offering proof of sin. "Your association with Mr. De Luca," Wolfe said, "allowed you access to a black market network capable of selling counterfeit coffee beans under the Costa label. You orchestrated the substitution to erode Costa's brand, thus driving down its value." He dropped the photo back into the folder with a soft thwack. "Your plan was simple: devalue Costa Espresso subtly, then propose a rescue by purchasing controlling interest at a discount." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. Luca's facade cracked. His hands twitched once, involuntarily. But Wolfe wasn't done. "When Marco discovered inconsistencies in the shipments," Wolfe said, "you panicked. You arranged to have him attacked, not killed but incapacitated. A warning, a disruption." Wolfe's eyes, dark and merciless, pinned Luca like a specimen to a board. "And when I began to intrude, you attempted intimidation. You infiltrated my home. You tampered with my kitchen." That last sentence carried a weight beyond mere criminality. In Wolfe's world there are sins, and then there are sins. "You miscalculated," Wolfe said softly. "Grossly." For a moment the room hung suspended between seconds. Then Luca laughed, short, sharp, ugly. "You can't prove it," he spat. Wolfe allowed a thin smile. "Proof is unnecessary for my client to act." He turned to Elena. "I advise you, Miss Costa, to retain counsel immediately, initiate a forensic audit, pursue civil remedies, and expel Mr. Moretti from all Costa Espresso operations." Elena nodded, her face white but resolute. Sophia stared at Luca with open contempt. Marco, dazed, seemed barely able to comprehend the collapse happening around him. Luca stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "This isn't over," he hissed. "No," Wolfe said mildly. "It is merely concluded." Luca stormed out. Sophia followed a beat later, her heels tapping a fast retreat. Marco stayed a moment longer, meeting Elena's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, low and rough. Then he, too, left. Elena slumped slightly in her chair, the fight draining out of her. Wolfe gestured toward the decanter. "Brandy, Miss Costa?" She shook her head, managing a faint smile. "No, thank you. I think I need something stronger." I chuckled and offered her my arm to help her up. As she left, she paused at the door. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You've saved more than just a company." He inclined his head. When the door closed behind her, the brownstone seemed to exhale, the tension finally bleeding away. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. "Archie," he said, "dinner," music to my ears. "And afterward," he added, "we shall enjoy an espresso, genuine, uncorrupted, and contemplate the infinite idiocy of human ambition." After Elena Costa left, the brownstone settled into its natural rhythm again, like a watch being wound back to the correct hour. Fritz, sensing the shift in the air, disappeared into the kitchen with renewed vigor. I heard the telltale clink of saucepans and the low, contented hum of a man in his element. Wolfe remained in his chair, hands resting lightly on the arms, his expression one of grim but undeniable satisfaction. I stayed where I was, perched on the arm of the red leather couch, notebook closed, waiting. Wolfe didn't speak until the grandfather clock in the hall announced 6:30. When he did, it was without opening his eyes. "You disapprove," he said. I blinked. "Me? Disapprove? I'm your #1 fan, boss." He snorted, which, coming from Wolfe, was practically a laugh riot. "You believe I should have allowed Mr. Moretti to implicate himself further? A confession, perhaps? A signed statement?" I shrugged. "Would have been nice, cleaner." Wolfe finally opened his eyes, brown and steady as old oak. "Bah! Confessions are the currency of fools. They embellish. They dilute truth with ego." He leaned forward slightly, the leather of his chair sighing under the shift. "What matters, Archie, what always matters, is control of fact and inference." He ticked off points on his thick fingers. Fact: Costa Espresso's quality decline. Was deliberate, internal. Fact: Mr. Moretti associated with individuals capable of counterfeit distribution. Fact: Upon pressure, Mr. Moretti sought to engineer a hasty buyout, avoiding scrutiny. Fact: Mr. Costa's assault coincided precisely with the exposure risk. He dropped his hand onto the armrest with finality. No confession necessary. The conclusion is inescapable, the remedy inevitable. I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. Still, I couldn't help feeling a faint twinge of regret. There was something clean about a confession, final, neat. But then again, when had human folly ever been neat? Fritz chose that moment to enter with a tray, plates of braised short ribs, buttered noodles, and a green salad that looked too virtuous to belong on the same table. He placed the tray carefully on the side table and gave Wolfe a short, respectful nod before retreating to the kitchen to let us feast in peace. We ate in near silence, the way we always did after a case wrapped. Wolfe chewing methodically, me polishing off my plate at double his speed and eyeing seconds. Only when the plates were cleared and the coffee was brewed, the real stuff, the genuine Costa Espresso from Elena's rescued reserves, did Wolfe permit himself the luxury of conversation. He sipped his demitasse, closed his eyes, and sighed with a satisfaction deep enough to shake the rafters. "Excellent," he pronounced. I raised my cup in salute. "No counterfeit beans this time." He cracked one eye open to give me a look. "Counterfeiters," he said, "are inevitable in any endeavor that yields prestige or profit. He set his cup down and folded his hands over his belly. But it is the internal traitor that does the most harm. I leaned back, letting the rich aroma of the coffee fill the room. You think Elena can salvage Costa Espresso? I asked. She possesses intelligence, Wolfe said. And now, certainty. She will purge the infection. Perhaps painfully, perhaps incompletely, but purge it she must. I considered that while sipping my coffee. Funny, I said. In the end, it wasn't about the beans, or the brand, or even the money. No, Wolfe agreed. It was about control, about ego, about the petty, persistent desire to possess, to manipulate, to reign. He closed his eyes again, more wearily this time. Human appetite, Archie, is a far more dangerous commodity than coffee. I let that sit for a moment. Wolfe was like that, dropping a philosophical bombshell between courses like a maître de fille, offering dessert menus. Outside, the late evening light was fading, the city sliding into its usual symphony of horns and footsteps and the occasional shouted curse. Inside, the brownstone was a fortress of calm, the way Wolfe demanded and, through careful warfare, preserved. After a long, thoughtful pause, I said, You know, boss, I'm starting to think I'll take human folly black, no sugar. Wolfe made a low sound deep in his throat. Not quite a laugh, but close enough. As you wish, he said. It remains bitter either way. We finished our coffee in silence, the two of us sealed inside our little domain, the world outside too, busy, too noisy, too fallible to matter for the moment. For tonight at least, justice of a sort had been served. And the coffee was finally perfect. Absolutely. Let's wrap it properly and fully, matching everything to your original vision. The next morning, the brownstone felt like a different world, or maybe the same one, just scrubbed clean and polished to a harder shine. The clatter of Fritz preparing breakfast drifted up from the kitchen. Sunlight angled across the parquet floors in warm slanted beams. Even the orchids upstairs, tended by Wolfe before breakfast with ritualistic exactitude, seemed somehow smugger than usual. As for Wolfe himself, he was in his chair, already halfway, through the day's mail, wearing the expression of a man personally responsible for the restoration of universal order. I slid into my usual spot in the office, coffee in hand, the real Costa Espresso again, brewed to perfection by Fritz, and served without irony. For a few minutes we let the normalcy settle, then I said, Elena called this morning. Wolfe grunted without looking up from his newspaper. She's moving fast, lawyers are in, Luca's officially out. She's buying out Sophia's shares too. Amicably, she says. Wolfe turned a page, as deliberate as a cat washing its paws. Sophia. We'll adapt, he said. That was about as charitable as Wolfe got regarding human resilience. And Marco? I asked. Another page turned. The faint rustle of newsprint marking time. He will be permitted to resign with dignity, if he chooses. I took a sip of coffee. And if he doesn't? Miss Costa will not hesitate, Wolfe said, setting the paper down finally and fixing me with a flat stare. She has learned the cost of hesitation. It struck me again, the cold calculus Wolfe applied so naturally. Loyalty mattered, but not at the expense of rot. Family or not, you had to cut the gangrenous parts loose if you wanted to survive, especially in business, especially in life. I leaned back and studied Wolfe, the heavy, immovable mountain of a man who had once again bent the world to his logical will without ever leaving his chair. Tell me something, boss, I said. You ever get tired of being right? He gave a small, theatrical sigh, half exasperation, half affectation. No, he said. I grinned. Didn't think so. The rest of the morning passed in a routine haze, mail, paperwork, a short trip upstairs to the plant rooms where Wolfe murmured Latin endearments to a batch of new phalaenopsis blooms. For me, there were invoices to file reports to type, and one particularly irate supplier to mollify after Wolfe refused, point blank, to endorse any more Costa products until the forensic audits were complete. "You will find," he told the rep crisply over the phone, "that premature endorsement is the refuge of charlatans and fools. Good day. Click, that was Nero Wolfe for you." A full-service wrecking ball, but with better vocabulary. By the time lunch rolled around, salmon mousse, sourdough rolls, and a cucumber salad crisp enough to shatter, things had settled into the kind of calm that only exists when you know the next war is still a few miles off. Not that it would stay that way. It never did. Closing the ledger after lunch, Wolfe returned to the office, cleaned his spectacles with the precision of a bomb technician, and settled in with his checkbook. That, more than anything, signaled that the case was truly closed. He recorded the retainer from Elena Costa with neat looping script, then calculated our expenses and profits with a satisfaction usually reserved for gourmet menus. I watched from my seat by the Globe bar, hands folded behind my head. "You ever think," I said, "that it's not the crimes that wear people out?" He glanced up, eyebrow arching. "It's the aftermath, picking up pieces, making new rules, learning who you can't trust anymore." Wolfe considered that, his thick fingers pausing briefly over the ledger. "The aftermath," he said, "is where character asserts itself, or collapses." He signed the final page with a flourish and closed the book. "Many men survive battle," he said. "Fewer survive peace." It was the kind of line Wolfe dropped without thinking, and the kind that stuck with you longer than you like to admit. I nodded, filing it away. Another page in the personal gospel of Nero Wolfe. "Justice is messy. Survival is optional. Dignity, for even more so." An unexpected visitor. Around 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Not a client, not a delivery. It was Saul Panzer, our unofficial third musketeer, looking as casual as ever in a soft fedora and a battered overcoat. He came into the office, nodded at Wolfe, and handed me an envelope. "For you," he said. I tore it open. Inside was a short note, unsigned, and a single key. The note read, "In case you ever want to open a real cafe." Attached to the key was a business card. Costa Espresso. Location. Confidential. I blinked, then laughed. Elena Costa, it seemed, hadn't just survived, she was thriving. Wolfe, predictably, showed no outward interest, but I caught the tiny twitch of one eyebrow. "Generosity," he said, "is best received skeptically." I tucked the key into my pocket. "Maybe someday, boss, you and me, a place of our own." He snorted again, twice in 2 days. A new record. You, Archie, could not manage a lemonade stand without converting it into a den of iniquity. Grinned. "No faith in me at all." "None whatsoever." We all chuckled, even Saul, who usually kept his expressions locked up tighter than a bank vault. The last word as the sun dipped low and the office bathed in gold. Wolfe leaned back in his chair and sighed. "A case concluded," he said, "a reputation restored. And another confirmation," he added, reaching for his demitasse of espresso, "that the greater threat to any enterprise is not the bold enemy without, but the petty traitor within." He lifted his cup toward me in a mock toast. "To espresso?" "Archie," I raised my own cup. "To betrayal, boss, the gift that keeps on giving." We clinked cups, a soft, almost ceremonial sound, and drank. Outside, the city roared and clattered, unaware or uncaring of the small, brutal dramas that shaped the world behind closed doors. Inside the brownstone, everything was in order. For now, and knowing us, that was about as good as it was ever going to get. The day after the case concluded, the brownstone was already settling into its familiar, slightly too perfect rhythm. Wolfe was, of course, buried in his chair, halfway through. An orchid catalogue he'd received from a specialist in South America. I was doing what I always did after a case, checking the mail, filing paperwork, and looking for some distraction that didn't involve immediate contact with human nature. But the air was different that day. There's a certain quiet that comes. After a case like this one, after the stakes are high and everyone is left standing, if only just, the adrenaline wears off. The questions become less pressing, and all that's left is the sound of life moving again, as relentlessly as it always does. I poured myself a cup of coffee, knowing full well that it wouldn't be the last of the day. Wolfe always had that effect on people. When the doorbell rang, I didn't even glance up. I'd gotten used to interruptions at this point, but this one was different, sharper, more insistent. I stood up, dusted off my jacket, and went to answer it. Standing at the front door was an unexpected sight, a uniformed delivery man holding a large, flat box. "Delivery for Mr. Nero Wolfe," the man said, handing me the package. "No return address." I blinked. That was rare. Wolfe wasn't known for receiving anonymous gifts. I took it inside, carefully setting it on the desk in front of him. Wolfe's attention didn't waver from his orchids, but his voice cut through the stillness. A gift? No return address. Could be something Chad's unfinished. I didn't even have to look at Wolfe to know he was intrigued. "Open it, Archie." Inside the box was a framed photograph, not one of those glossy promotional shots you see in advertisements. No, this was a candid shot of a dusty alley, taken from a shadowed corner. A delivery truck with the Costa Espresso logo was parked in the background, its doors wide open, revealing stacks of crates that had no business being there. At the front of the photo stood a familiar face, Luca Moretti. The delivery man had been right. The photograph was, in fact, unfinished, a glimpse into a much deeper, far-reaching scheme. Wolfe took the photograph and studied it closely, his hands still. His voice, when it came, was almost casual. "So it seems we were not finished, after all." I couldn't help the grin that tugged at my mouth. "Another one of those little gifts, huh?" "Indeed," Wolfe said, tapping his fingers on the edge of the frame. "Luca Moretti has been playing a game far more complicated than we first realized. This photograph tells us a simple truth. The betrayal was not just within the Costa family. It reached further into the veins of the distribution network, perhaps even further still." I frowned. So he wasn't working alone. He had help. Help? No, more like a plan. A very carefully laid out plan. The photograph, though unsigned, was clearly meant to be a reminder of the missed pieces, the unspoken truths that Wolfe had seen long before the final revelation. The strategy behind the whole affair had been too neat, too orchestrated. It had never been about a simple case of sabotage. There had been an ulterior motive lurking behind it, one that had taken advantage of the chaos, feeding off the family's internal strife. Wolfe stood and walked to the window, his back turned to me as he considered the city outside. "This photograph suggests a deeper ambition," he said softly. "Not just to ruin Costa Espresso, but to control it, to redirect the flow of beans, the flow of profit, into darker channels." I mulled over that for a moment, meaning someone was using the Costa name as a front. Someone was waiting, in the wings. Wolfe nodded without turning around. "Precisely. A player we haven't yet seen." My eyes scanned the photograph again. The edges of the photo were frayed, as though it had been slipped into someone's pocket a few too many times. "And this is supposed to be the final warning." Wolfe turned, his gaze hard. "The warning was not for us, Archie." I felt the weight of that hit me. The warning was meant for someone else. The game wasn't over. For now, though, it was quiet, almost too quiet. And in that silence, Wolfe took another sip of espresso, leaning back in his chair, as he often did when he was certain. He let the pause linger, long enough to settle in our bones. Finally, he spoke again in a voice that carried the quiet certainty of a man who knew the battle was far from won. We must watch carefully, Archie. The Costa brand may be safe for now, but there are forces still at play, ones we haven't fully uncovered. I leaned back in my own chair, eyes narrowing at the familiar feeling of unresolved tension. I guess the next move's on us, then? Wolfe let out a sigh, his thick fingers drumming lightly on the desk. Always, Archie, always. It is never the end of the story, only a chapter. With that, the last chapter was closed, at least for now. But as I looked over at Wolfe sitting there so still and composed, I knew this case wouldn't be the last. There would always be more schemes, more webs to untangle. And for better or worse, I'd be right there beside him. And as long as I was, there was one thing I knew for sure: it would never be dull. That's the conclusion, the lingering threat, the unresolved tension, the final realization, and Wolfe's quiet dominance over every aspect of the case make for a satisfying wrap-up to this chapter, while also leaving space for future mysteries. Would you like me to prepare the full compiled version for easy reading or adjust anything else?